Sienna God, hello all. Osha Sonali, good morning, and Wado, thank you for watching. So this is day 6 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, part B. Throughout most of the history of the human race, most people have made a living in agriculture, typically through arduous labor. The beginning of the Industrial Revolution meant for most people the transfer of the scene of that arduous labor from farm to factory. To such people, those who earned their livings without visible toil, with clean hands, and by simply selling things that others had produced at higher prices than the producers had charged, were ready targets of resentment, especially when these non-producers enjoyed a higher standard of living than those who worked in factories or on farms. It did not have to be a dramatically higher standard of living. Those nearby on the socioeconomic scale are often more hotly resented than distant rich people. Just as there are those who believe that only workers who had tangible physical objects in their production process are quote unquote really producing output. So they believe that middlemen who physically produce nothing are merely parasites who insert themselves gratuitously between the quote unquote real producers and the consumers. If this crude misconception seems like too little to account for so many centuries of hostility and violence against so many groups that are typically non-violent themselves, it is nevertheless at the core of the animosities that have endured even after most members of middlemen minorities have moved on to professional careers in medicine, law, and other fields. The economic fallacy. Even in the absence of differences in toil or reward, the seeming conjuring of wealth out of thin air, apparently by quote unquote overcharging others or making them pay back more money than was lent, has been seen as parasitic activity rather than as a contribution to the well-being of the community. Suspicions are readily aroused against an occupation where an income is generated. In Friedrich Hayek's Hayek words, in quotes, out of nothing, without physical creation, and by merely rearranging what already exists, end quote, an operation that to the uninitiated seems to, quote unquote, stink of sorcery. Demagogues can easily supply theories that play upon the pre-existing suspicion and misapprehension. However, even in the absence of demagogues or of ethnic differences, economic role alone can generate negative reactions. An often cited economist, account of rudimentary economic activities with a prisoner of war camp in Germany during World War II showed the economic and social role of middlemen among the men in the camp. Prisoners of war were fed by their captors while monthly shipments of Red Cross packages supplemented their food and provided a few amenities like chocolates and cigarettes. All prisoners received the same material goods, but of course they valued different items differently. Non-smokers traded cigarettes for chocolates. 6 SIKHS among the prisoners traded away canned beef or jam for margarine. On days when the Red Cross packages arrived, direct one-on-one trades created chaos in a camp with more than 1,000 prisoners. Camp authorities sought to bring some order into the situation by setting up bulletin boards on which prisoners could make their offers or trades. But what proved to be even more efficient arose spontaneously among the prisoners themselves. Particular prisoners would circulate around the camp, trading back and forth, playing the role of middleman among their numerous fellow prisoners who traded with one another without coming into direct contact. The other prisoners saved themselves the bother, and the middleman ended up with more material goods, in effect, charging for their services. The middlemen who emerged in this informal economy were not necessarily ethically different. Those individuals who played the middleman role in the camp ranged from Catholic chaplain to Sikh. Moreover, the needs they met, though seemingly trivial from the perspective of a larger and more affluent society, were matters of quote-unquote urgency, according to a British economist who was one of the prisoners. Things like cigarettes, jam, razor blades, and writing paper meant a lot in the grim conditions of a prisoner of war camp. The other function of middlemen, lending and charging interest, also arose in the camp. As prisoners' supplies of cigarettes or sugar ran low near the end of the month, those who had saved these items would provide them to those had run out. What? Those who had saved these items would provide them to those had run out. That's what it says. In exchange for a pledge to pay back more than was lent when the next Red Cross packages arrived. The economist among them was fascinated to see many of the economic phenomena associated with the complex market economy appearing spontaneously in these primitive conditions, but he also noted social and political phenomena generated by the work of middlemen. Taken as a whole, opinion was hostile to the middleman. His function and his hard work in bringing buyer and seller together were ignored. Profits were not regarded as a reward for labor, but as the result of sharp practices, despite the fact that his very extensive existence, despite the fact that his very existence was proof of the contrary. The middleman was held to be redundant. Here in the microcosm was the fundamental problem of the middleman down through the centuries and around the world. And the prisoner of war camp, at least these misconceptions were not compounded by the additional factor of ethnically different middlemen, and there was no market for political demagoguery. Social prerequisites. In the larger world, the economic role of the middleman minority, as distinguished from that of isolated individuals, implies various social patterns. For a particular minority group to become dominant in retailing or money lending, whether at a high or a low economic level, means that their behavior pattern must be fundamentally different from that of the surrounding population. Otherwise, the majority population would supply the majority of the middlemen in their own society. This crucial difference cannot be simply that the middleman minority has more money again and again in different ages. And in various countries, the middleman minority has arrived on the scene as destitute immigrants, owning virtually nothing and barely able to speak a few words of the language of the country. This was the situation of vast numbers of Eastern European Jews who arrived in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. The greatest concentration of Jews in the world was on New York's Lower East Side, where a 1908 study showed that about half the families slept 3 or 4 people to a room, nearly 1/4 slept 5 or more to a room, and fewer than 1/4 slept 2 to a room. During the same era, Chinese immigrants typically arrived in Southeast Asian countries in similar rock bottom poverty. For example, immigrant Chinese arriving in Indonesia usually brought nothing but a bundle of clothes, a mat, and a pillow. It was much the same story with the Lebanese immigrants to colonial Sierra Leone, and in later era, Korean immigrants and Vietnamese refugees to the United States. Whatever economic progress such people could make would come slowly and as a result of a long uphill struggle. How could middlemen minorities rise from such beginnings? More to the point, how could they eventually rise above the native-born population around them? Clearly, their values, their discipline, and their culture had to be different. Moreover, if they wanted their children to succeed, they had to make sure to keep these crucial intangible assets different. Accordingly, middleman minorities around the world have distanced themselves and their children from social involvement with the very different people around them, whose differences were the basis of their livelihood, and have therefore often been accused of being clannish, quote unquote clannish. Yeah, that's true. This term has been applied not only to the Jews in Europe and America, but also the other side of the world, to the Parsis of India, and other middleman minorities in between. Even when middlemen have lived in the slums, their children have worked harder and succeeded more often in the same schools where other children were failing. That was not only the history of Jewish children in the United States, but also of Chinese children in Southeast Asia. Children of the Tamil, T-A-M-I-L, middleman minority in Sri Lanka, or Korean immigrant children in the United States, and other offspring of middleman minorities elsewhere. Middleman minorities struggling up from the bottom could not afford to have their children absorb the values of the society around them. Clannishness was all but inevitable. The social differentness, compounded by social withdrawal from the larger society, creates additional sources of resentment and hostility faced by a middleman minority, besides the resentments growing out of the middleman economic role as such. Yet, if the middleman minorities were not different, they would be of little use to others. People who do not save, for example, are able to get loans or to buy on credit from middleman minorities precisely because the latter do save. If middleman minorities were as improvident as their customers or clients, they would have nothing to offer them, and their businesses would be very short-lived. The ability to save has played a key role in the rise of middleman minorities. An observer in India noted, in quotes, Gujaratis, Gujaratis, were rigorous savers, and their families worked endless hours and lived abstemiously, ABSTEMIOUSLY, to ensure their success, end quote. The same thing could be said of the Jews, the Koreans, Lebanese, and many other middlemen minorities. Although middlemen minorities often began at the bottom, it was typically at the bottom of entrepreneurial activities, often as peddlers with packs on their backs. The more fortunate ones with push carts, and usually somewhat later, small shops. Even such large enterprises as Macy's, Bloomingdale's, and Levi Strauss among the Jews, and Hagar, Haggar, and Farah, Farah, among the Lebanese, began at the level of the lowly peddler. According to A History of the Jews in the United States, in quotes, staggering numbers of Jews in the decades before and after the Civil War first experienced America through peddling, end quote, which became, in quotes, the nearly universal American Jewish male experience, end quote. While Jewish peddlers worked as isolated individuals, their supplies came from a wider network. Each peddler functioned in a long Jewish economic chain linking shopkeepers to Jewish wholesalers in the larger cities on whom they depended for credit. The Jewish peddler on the road served as the agent of the Jewish town shopkeeper and the big city jobber. This trading network depended on intercommunal trust. Wholesaler and peddler understood each other, spoke the same language, and knew the same people. Jewish wholesalers in port cities from New York to San Francisco supplied Jewish peddlers with merchandise, which they carried on their backs into the hinterlands to farmers, miners, railroad crews, and others working far from the big cities and often in places where there were few or no stores. Peddlers, of course, also worked in cities and in every region of the country, from the southern plantations to the California mining camps, where Levi Strauss first began to sell the rugged trousers that were to make his name famous. While Jewish peddlers often worked in isolation among a non-Jewish population, they were nevertheless tied to a wider Jewish community, not only by commercial ties to Jewish wholesalers and manufacturers, but also to family members in Europe and America. They often saved money to pay for transatlantic passage for relatives in Europe to come and join them. These savings at some point also allowed the peddler to set up a little shop in town, settle down, get married, and raise a family. The wives and children then worked in the same little business. Often the Jewish shopkeeper or other small businessman and his family lived above or behind the store. Milton Friedman's, Friedman, family lived this way when he was growing up, a pattern that he described as common among the immigrants to America in that era. Yet this pattern was by no means confined to Jews or to America. Similar economic and social patterns could be found among Lebanese in Sierra Leone and among other middlemen minorities in other parts of the world. The overseas Chinese storekeeper in the Philippines was likewise, in quotes, willing to live in a small corner of his store, end quote. As among the Jews, Lebanese children were initiated into their family businesses in the United States, as were the children of the other middlemen minorities in other countries. Whereas a minority of sons and daughters peddled at an early age, many, perhaps the majority of the store owners' children, were prepared for life behind a counter. School-age children, when not in school, were at their parents' elbows, waiting on customers, making change, stocking shelves, and imbibing the shrewdness of operating an independent business on meager resources. They were inculcated, inculcated, with the parents' work and thrift ethics, and the lesson that family unity and self-denial was essential to the family's goals. Lebanese children were likewise initiated into their family stores and into its economic culture in Sierra Leone. A similar pattern could be found among Korean shoppers. In late 20th century New York, where family members contributed many hours of unpaid labor toward the family business, for example, Mr. Kim and his son daily purchase vegetables at 4 o'clock every morning when the dawn is coming. They get up and drive to Hunts Point in the Bronx, where a city-run wholesale market is located. In the market, they run in order to buy at low prices as many as 170 different kinds of vegetables and fruits. All the transactions are made in cash. At 7 o'clock, they return to the store and mobilize the rest of the family members in order to wash and trim vegetables. While Korean greengrocers in New York worked long hours by doing wholesale shopping early in the morning at Hunts Point, other greengrocers waited for a delivery service to bring fruits and vegetables to them. The Koreans not only saved the cost of the delivery service, they were able to pick the best quality fruits and vegetables available, and by having the family wash, clip, and sort them, reduce the rate of spoilage. But it took a toll. In quotes, they use expressions such as bloody urine, drastic loss of weight, and benumbed fingers like a leper's when they describe the daily struggle of operating their businesses, end quote. In Atlanta, Korean store owners worked an average of 63 hours per week, with 1/5 working 80 hours or more, end quote. Early Lebanese businesses in the United States were noted for, in quotes, opening 16 to 18 hours daily, end quote, utilizing, in quotes, the assistance of the whole family, end quote. During the earlier rise of Chinese shopkeepers in Southeast Asia, 16 to 18-hour days were also common. And market gardeners from India who settled in the 19th century South Africa peddling produce could be seen weeding their gardens by moonlight after hawking fruits and vegetables in the cities during the day. Because being a peddler or even a small store owner does not require any large amount of capital, these are occupations open to innumerable people. So that widespread competition has been common. And that in turn means that profits cannot come easily or without long hours of work and much attention to the business, as well as living within limited means. Nevertheless, such sacrifices tend to eventually pay off. In 18th century Russia province of Astrakhan, Astrakhan, people from India arrived, in quotes, with very small means, which they then increased in Astrakhan by trade, and living there continuously for 10, 20, or 30 years, become extremely wealthy, so that some among them have now 1 or more 100,000 rubles in their possession, end quote. While some observers might regard such determination and resourcefulness as admirable or inspiring, to others the rise of middlemen minorities from poverty to prosperity has been like a slap across the face. If accepted as an achievement, it raises painful questions about others who have achieved nothing comparable, despite in some cases being initially more fortunate. Someone who was born rich represents no such assault on the ego and creates no such resentment or hostility. Anyone who can offer an alternative explanation of these middlemen's successes, such as calling them quote-unquote parasites or quote-unquote bloodsuckers who have prospered at the expense of others, has been popular in many countries, and some have built entire careers and whole movements on such popularity. When people are presented with the alternatives of hating themselves for their future or hating others for their success, they seldom choose to hate themselves. More commonly, they will listen to even inconsistent or irrational arguments against middlemen, for example, against the Chinese in the Philippines. Pressed as to his case against the Chinese, the Filipino politician would say that the Chinese were too numerous, that they had more than half of the retail business in their hands, that they charged too high prices, cheating in weights and measures, and made high profits. Should it be objected that if this were so, all the Filipino has to do was to open up a tienda of his own and put the Chinese out of business in the village, the politician would probably shift his ground. He would now say that the Chinese standard of living is deplorably low. The owner of a Chinese tienda is willing to live in a small corner of his store that he eats almost nothing and works day and night. So does his family and his assistant, if he has one. The Chinese in Manila, he says, persistently disregard the 8-hour law. In fine, the charge now is that the Chinese runs his business with too little, not with too great overhead expenses and profits. If this is true, then the Chinese gives excellent service to the community and as distributors. The Filipino can buy cheaply because the Chinese live so meagerly. A common charge against middlemen minorities in countries around the world is that they operate illegally and often corrupt the authorities with bribes. What is often overlooked by those who make such charges is that discriminatory restrictions and prohibitions against middlemen minorities make it virtually impossible for them to operate legally and still make a living. Sometimes they have been deprived of citizenship in the land of their birth, even with their families, when their families have lived there for generations, or the citizenship available to them does not include the same rights as those of indigenous citizens. Till we meet again, love you, mean it.